The COINTELPRO Papers. Introduction. A glimpse into the files of America's political police. The inescapable message of much of the material we have covered is that the FBI jeopardizes the whole system of freedom of expression, which is the cornerstone of an open society. At worst, it raises the specter of a police state. In essence, the FBI conceives of itself as an instrument to prevent radical social change in America. The Bureau's view of its function leads it beyond data collection and into political warfare. Thomas I. Emerson, Yale Law Professor, 1971. A picture, as they say, is worth 1,000 words. Actually seeing the visual representation of that which others describe, and from which they draw conclusions, can serve for many people as a sort of ultimate proof of the propositions at issue. The truth of this old adage seems quite pronounced in this instance, which leads us to reproduce secret FBI documents to allow the Bureau to document its own lawlessness. In Agents of Repression, the FBI's secret wars against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement, South End Press, 1988, we endeavored to prove, among other things, that the Bureau has since its inception acted not as the country's foremost crime-fighting agency, an image it has always actively promoted in collaboration with a vast array of quote-unquote friendly media representatives and scholars, but as America's political police engaged in all manner of extralegality and illegality as expedients to containing and controlling political diversity within the United States. In essence, we argued that the FBI's raison d'etre is and always has been the implementation of what the Bureau formally designated from the mid-1950s through the early 70s as COINTELPRO's, designated to disrupt and destabilize, cripple, destroy, or otherwise neutralize dissident individuals and political groupings in the United States, a process denounced by congressional investigators as being, quote, a sophisticated vigilante operation. Our case, it seemed to us, was rather plainly made. Such clarity is, predictably enough, anathema to the Bureau and the more conscious apologists it has cultivated, both of whom wish to deny the realities we have sought to expose. For the FBI, as the broader political legalistic structure of which it is an integral part, there are matters of policy and outright criminal culpability to be covered up through systematic denial of truth and the extension of certain countervailing mythologies. Many apologists have based their careers and professional reputations on shielding the Bureau from exposure while assisting in the perfection and perpetuation of its preferred myths. On this score, a review of Agents of Repression, written for the Washington Post by Ethan Theoharis, a professor at Marquette University, served as an instructive example. The techniques employed in this attempt to discredit our thesis afford virtual textbook instruction in how the facts of the Bureau's activities and agenda are obscured from the public by properly anointed experts, while the officially approved image of the Bureau is reinforced, or at least maintained, through the mainstream media. Consequently, the Post review bears detailed scrutiny of myth and documentation. After accurately summarizing the main thrust of our conclusions regarding the nature, scope, and duration of the FBI's domestic counterintelligence operations, Theoharis tries to bring about their dismissal out of hand. Quote, "Do the authors document these alarming charges?" he asked. The answer is quite simply, they do not. Observe that he does not attempt to challenge the appropriateness of the documentation we offer, arguing that it is insufficient to our purposes or that we have somehow misinterpreted it. Instead, he asserts that we use no documentation at all, a claim intended to lead his readers to the false impression that agents consist of nothing more than a lengthy stream of heavy-handed and unsupported accusations against the FBI. In order to accomplish this gross distortion, he simply remains silent about the fact that we accompanied our 388 pages of text with 79 pages of notes, all in fine print, some 1,513 entries in all, hundreds of them citing more than a single source, and fully a third referring to specific FBI and/or other government documents. Having ignored the evidentiary record upon which we base our work, he contrives to extend a countering, essentially fictitious, quote-unquote, record of his own, focusing on our main thesis that rather than being suspended in anything other than name in 1971, when the FBI says it was, COINTELPRO was actually continued and even escalated against the American Indian movement over the next several years. The reviewer sets his stage. The most serious problem with Agents, he says, is that the authors seem indifferent to the uniqueness and thus significance of the FBI's COINTELPRO operations. They were unique because Bureau officials launched formal action-oriented programs whose main purpose was not to collect evidence for prosecution, and in the process created a rather comprehensive written record of their actions. He goes on to claim that, in contrast to its activities against the Black Panthers before 1971, activities authorized and monitored exclusively by the Bureau, the FBI's activities involving AIM were designed to result in judicial prosecution and were subject to review by Justice Department officials. The FBI files released on AIM do not document a program of harassment. In this passage, Theoharis has carefully implanted another pair of serious pieces of disinformation in his supposedly factual rebuttal. One concerns the extent to which the Bureau has made available documents concerning its anti-AIM campaign, while the other centers upon what is allegedly revealed within this documentation. Both of these contribute directly to furtherance of the myth by which the FBI wishes to be publicly understood. Each element will be considered in turn, because both reveal much about the methods and functions of academic apologists in service to the Bureau propaganda system. The AIM files. After mentioning the FBI files released on AIM, Theoharis sums up his point with a snide query. Can we then read between the lines and conclude that by the 1970s, FBI actions were not recorded in writing? Leaving aside the possibility that by this point in its history, agents might well have learned not to record certain things in written form, it is abundantly clear to anyone familiar with the material to which the reviewer refers that neither we nor he has had the opportunity to assess what the FBI did or did not commit to paper with regard to its actions against AIM. Still less have we been forced to, quote-unquote, read between the lines of available documents in order to arrive at conclusions contradicted by such evidence. Contrary to Theoharis' smug remark about what his own perusal of these files shows, the fact of the matter is that the vast bulk of them have never been released. Although the Bureau acknowledges having compiled hundreds of thousands of quote-unquote investigative documents during the course of its major anti-AIM activities, only 17,000 odd pages of this material have been declassified and made available to researchers at the Reading Room facility in FBI headquarters. And most of these show extensive deletions. The reviewer is being deliberately misleading when he casually juxtaposes the veritable mountains of paper available through the FBI on its Black Panther COINTELPRO with the paucity of documents made available on AIM, pretending these are equivalent databases, and then suggests he had predicated his conclusions upon a comparison of the two sets of files. Nor is he more forthcoming about why such a disparity in the availability of these records exists. In essence, the FBI was quite literally forced to divulge most of its Panther files by the Senate Select Committee to study government operations during hearings held in 1974 and 1975. Conversely, the Bureau was able to avoid being compelled to do this with regard to its anti-AIM operations under circumstances which bear recounting. Concerning the Panther documents, the Senate committee itself found its hand forced by a seemingly endless series of revelations about governmental transgressions during the 1970s. There was a credibility gap engendered by the federal executive branch having been caught lying too many times, too red-handedly, and over too many years in its efforts to dupe the public into supporting the U.S. war in Southeast Asia. This had reached epic proportions when Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, a highly secret government documentary history of official duplicity by which America had become embroiled in Indochina and caused particularly sensitive excerpts to be published in the New York Times. The situation was greatly exacerbated by the so-called Watergate scandal, which followed immediately, in which it was publicly revealed that virtually the entire Nixon administration had been, as a matter of course, engaging in exactly the same sort of behavior on many other fronts, both at home and abroad. To compound the crisis even further, a citizens' action group raided the FBI's Media Pennsylvania resident agency, appropriated its files, and exposed the long secret existence of COINTELPRO in the Washington Post. As a result of all of these factors, public confidence in government was at an all-time low and showed signs of unraveling even further. In this peculiar and potentially volatile set of circumstances, a government-wide effort was undertaken to convince the citizenry that its institutions were fundamentally sound, albeit in need of fine-tuning and a bit of house-cleaning. It was immediately announced that U.S. ground forces would be withdrawn from Vietnam as rapidly as possible. Televised congressional hearings were staged to get to the bottom of Watergate, a spectacle which soon led to the resignations of a number of Nixon officials, the brief imprisonment of a few of them, and the eventual resignation of the president himself. Another form assumed by this high-level exercise in re-establishing a national consensus favoring faith in government was the conducting of a series of well-publicized and tightly scripted show trial type hearings with regard to the various police and intelligence agencies which had been exposed as complicit in the Vietnam and Watergate messes. For its part, the FBI was cast as an agency which had, in the past, no matter how recent, and temporarily, no matter how long the duration, gotten out of control, thus aberrantly but busily trampling upon citizens' civil and constitutional rights in the name of social and political orthodoxy. To add just the right touch of melodrama to the whole affair, the Bureau was made to confess to a certain range of its already completed COINTELPRO operations, such as the not directly lethal dimensions of its anti-Panther activities, and to provide extensive portions of its internal documentation of these misdeeds. As a finale, Bureau officials were made to appear properly contrite, while promising never to engage in such naughty things again. The FBI's quid pro quo for cooperating in this charade seems to have been that none of its agents would actually see the inside of a prison as a result of the excesses thereby revealed. The object of all this illusory congressional muscle flexing was, of course, to instill in the public a perception that Congress had finally gotten tough, placing itself in a position to administer appropriate oversight of the FBI. It followed that citizens had no further reasons to worry over what the Bureau was doing at that very moment, or what it might do in the future. This in turn would allow the status quo sufficient breathing room to pass laws and executive orders gradually converting the FBI's COINTELPRO-style illegalities into legal or at least protected spheres of endeavor. The selling of this bill of goods was apparently deemed so important that Congress was willing to go to extreme lengths in achieving success. Hence, in 1975, the Senate Select Committee concluded that in order to complete its rebuilding of the required public impression, it might be necessary to risk going beyond exploration of the Bureau's past counterintelligence practices and explore ongoing, i.e., ostensibly post-COINTELPRO FBI conduct vis-a-vis political activists. Specifically at issue in this connection was what was even then being done to AIM, and hearings were scheduled to begin in July. But this is where the Bureau, which had been reluctantly going along up to that point, drew the line. The hearings never happened. Instead, they were indefinitely postponed. In late June of 1975, at the direct request of the FBI and on the basis of what by the Bureau's own admission turned out to have been a major disinformation ploy designed to win it widespread public support. The FBI's AIM files have thus ended up not in the public domain as Theo Harris would have had his readers believe, but amongst the Bureau's most secret archives. While it is true, as the reviewer states, that the relatively few AIM files the FBI has chosen to release do not document a program of harassment, what he intentionally leaves unstated is even more true. The released files in themselves provide a vastly insufficient evidentiary base from which Theo Harris or anyone else might conclusively determine whether a de facto COINTELPRO was conducted against AIM. And sheer common sense will warn that the Bureau has not so fiercely resisted producing its records in this matter because their content is neutral or serves to absolve it of wrongdoing. Judicial prosecution. The obvious question at this point is whether the FBI's success in blocking access to AIM files makes it impossible to arrive at any legitimate conclusion concerning what the Bureau did to that organization. Are we guilty, as Theo Harris claims, of mere reliance upon guilt by association, i.e., that because the FBI launched a formal program to harass the Black Panthers, it adopted the same practices against AIM? Hardly. Even disregarding such unofficial sources as eyewitness and victim accounts of various episodes of the Bureau's anti-AIM campaign, many of which we will always insist hold at least as much validity and integrity as any FBI teletype, field report, or memorandum, there are still a great number of official sources which we could and did use to support the conclusions we reached in Agents. These include several reports of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, a pair of reports of the Justice Department's Task Force on Indian Matters, a report of the Senate Committee on Judiciary, Subcommittee on Internal Security, the findings of the federally sponsored Minnesota Citizens Commission to review the FBI, a report from the General Accounting Office, transcripts of the 97th Congress, first session on FBI authorizations, several legal dispositions, Bureau of Prison Records, grand jury summaries, voluminous trial transcripts, an array of legal briefs and hearing transcripts, transcriptions of oral arguments on appeal, and a number of judicial opinions. These sources, adding up to tens of thousands of pages of documentation, were all cited repeatedly, and most of them quoted in Agents. Theo Harris avoids mentioning this extensive documentary base, consisting of the same sort of material he himself has drawn upon quite heavily in his own books on the FBI, while summarily dismissing our effort as undocumented. And well he might. The conclusions reached in virtually every item of the real record correspond quite neatly with one or more of those drawn in Agents. This is to say that the tangible, officially available record of the FBI's anti-AIM campaign leads directly away from the sort of absolution of the Bureau Theo Harris seeks to foist in his readers. It was, after all, the Civil Rights Commission, not Churchill and Vanderwall, which determined after extensive on-site investigation that the FBI had been complicit in rigging the 1974 Pine Ridge tribal election against AIM candidates. And it was this same federal agency which officially reported that the Bureau was involved in perpetuating a reign of terror against AIM members and supporters on the same reservation during the same period. Similarly, it was not the tendentious authors of Agents, but Federal District Judge Fred Nickel, who noted that he was dismissing charges against AIM defendants because of the methods employed by the FBI and federal prosecutors. "The waters of justice have been polluted," said the judge, "by the Bureau he had revered for so long, but which had stooped so low in its vendetta against AIM. And again, it was not us but the foreman of a federal jury who, when acquitting other AIM defendants of murder charges the FBI had lodged against them, observed that aspects of the case assembled by the Bureau had been so obviously fabricated that not a member of the jury believed them. We could, as we did in Agents, go on in this vein for hundreds of pages, but that book has already been written." The last two examples are especially important, however, since they disprove Theo Harris's argument that, in contrast to its activities against the Black Panthers, the FBI's activities involving AIM were designed to result in judicial prosecution. The first untruth embedded in this proposition is that the COINTELPRO directed against the Panthers did not use false prosecution as a tactic. The reality is, as is borne out in a Bureau document quoted verbatim in Agents, key black activists were repeatedly arrested on any excuse until they could no longer make bail. As an illustration of how this worked, we examined in some detail the case of former Panther leader Geronimo Pratt, imprisoned in San Quentin for the past 18 years as a result of FBI actions causing him to be repeatedly prosecuted on bogus charges until he was finally convicted of a murder the Bureau had knew he never committed. As concerns AIM, the facts, which Theo Harris opts to ignore, fit precisely the same pattern. After the 1973 siege of Wounded Knee, for instance, the FBI caused 542 separate charges to be filed against those it identified as key AIM leaders. Russell Means alone was faced with 37 felony and 3 misdemeanor charges. Organization members often languished in jail for months, as the cumulative bail required to free them outstripped resource capabilities of AIM and supporting groups. Yet, when it came time for the trials, the transparency of the Bureau's evidence was such that hundreds of charges were simply dropped, while the remaining defendants were acquitted in droves. The net result of this FBI prosecution effort was an absurdly low 15 convictions, all on such petty or contrived offenses as interfering with a federal officer in the performance of his duty. None of the 40 charges leveled at Means held up in court. But while the juridical nature of what the Bureau was doing may be seen as ludicrous at best, this prosecutorial element of the anti-AIM campaign self-evidently served to disrupt, destabilize, and even cripple its target. At another level, one might reasonably ask, what sort of bona fide investigation to facilitate prosecution is involved in FBI agents bribing an individual, as they did with Louis Move's camp, to testify as an eyewitness to the participation of others in felonious acts allegedly committed at a time when the witness was 1,000 miles from the scene? This is just one of the Bureau activities involving AIM, which came out during the 1974 trial of Russell Means and Dennis Banks, the sort of activity which caused Judge Nickel to dismiss charges and write the opinion quoted earlier. The same query might be entered with regard to other of the FBI's efforts to secure conviction of AIM members. For example, what sort of legitimacy is it that attaches itself to the arrangement in which charges were dropped against Marvin Redshirt, confessed murderer of Los Angeles cab driver George Aird, in exchange for his admittedly perjured testimony against AIM members Paul Skyhorse Durant and Richard Mohawk Billings, men who were subsequently exonerated from having any part in the crime? We can easily go on framing such questions. What exactly is the difference between the way the FBI subverted the judicial system to get results during its COINTELPROs against black extremists and its well-documented kidnapping and raw coercion of a mentally unbalanced Indian woman, Myrtle Poorbear, in order to force her to sign 3 mutually contradictory and utterly false affidavits? The Bureau's choice of the affidavits was, to be sure, duly submitted in court as an expedient to obtaining AIM member Leonard Peltier's extradition from Canada. For that matter, what is the precise distinction between the COINTELPRO usage of phony witnesses such as Julio Butler in order to obtain the murder conviction of Geronimo Pratt on the one hand, and the FBI's later use of Poorbear in the same capacity to secure a murder conviction against AIM member Richard Marshall on the other? And again, what are we to make of FBI agents who went on the stand and testified to one thing in the murder trial of AIM members Dino Butler and Bob Ribadeau, only to reverse completely their testimony on the same events during the subsequent trial of Leonard Peltier on the same charge? Obviously, the documented nature of the FBI's activities, designed to result in judicial prosecution of AIM members, was identical to those it employed under the rubric of COINTELPRO against the Black Panther Party and other black liberation organizations. For Theoharis to argue that the Bureau's prosecutorial tactics against AIM are normal FBI procedure not only tends to dissolve the very distinction between the COINTELPRO and post-COINTELPRO errors he seeks to establish, it bespeaks a very interesting view on his part of how the judicial process should be used. Theoharis does make an important and serious point when he observes that the Panther COINTELPRO was action-oriented in ways which went beyond any conceivable definition of the judicial arena. We agree, so much so that in Agents we broke the tactical methodologies of COINTELPRO out into 10 separate categories, only one of which concerned manipulation of the judicial system, and demonstrated by example how each had been applied to the Panthers and other black liberation groups. This, however, hardly serves to validate either his assertion of a contrast between what was done to the Panthers and AIM, or his contention that the latter was not subjected to a comparable program of harassment. To the contrary, we also demonstrated, on the basis of available documentation, that each of the remaining 9 non-judicial COINTELPRO methods was utilized during the repression of AIM. Take, for example, the category of black propaganda. In the book, we quote verbatim one of the FBI's dog soldier teletypes, deliberately released to the press in 1976 under the guise of alerting the public to the quote-unquote fact that some 2,000 AIM warriors were on the verge of launching an outlandish wave of terrorism throughout South Dakota. We cite a number of articles in major newspapers across the country in which this disinformation immediately and prominently appeared, as well as statements by local police authorities responding to the quote-unquote menace. And we quote then Director of the FBI Clarence Kelly, on the witness stand shortly thereafter, admitting that he knew of no factual basis whatsoever to support these wild public allegations on the part of his typically closed-mouthed bureau. Several other instances of FBI activity vis-a-vis AIM in the propaganda area are also chronicled and substantiated with comparable documentation in agents. Or take the matter of the COINTELPRO tactic of infiltrating agents provocateurs into target organizations. Provocateurs, as opposed to mere informants, are used to actively and illegally disrupt, entrap, and otherwise neutralize their quarry. In agents, we present an undeniable case that this was done to AIM in exactly the same fashion as it was done to the Panthers. The matter concerns the activities of one Douglas Durham, and is abundantly documented through such sources as the earlier mentioned Skyhorse Mohawk case, during which FBI undercover employee Durham went on the stand impersonating an Iowa psychologist in order to cause bail to be denied the defendants. The provocateur's own admission of what he'd done after he was unmasked as an infiltrator in 1975, and his subsequent testimony before the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security. And so it goes, point by point, down the entire list of elements comprising the Bureau's COINTELPRO repertoire. All of this disproves Theo Harris's assertion that when it came to AIM, the FBI's methods were designed only to result in legitimate judicial prosecution. It also contradicts his accusation that, in concluding otherwise, we were forced to rely upon sheer guilt by association. And by rights, it should expose for what it really is the reviewer's allegation that at no time do we substantiate our conjecture that an FBI orchestrated conspiracy to harass AIM. Contrary to the fabricated version of reality presented in the Post Review, it has been solidly demonstrated that the American Indian movement was very much the victim of a de facto COINTELPRO operation. Mythology. Merely being on the receiving end of a disingenuous review, while never pleasant, hardly warrants the assembly of an in-depth counter-critique such as we have provided here. At issue here, however, is not just the fact that Theo Harris used his mainstream media forum as a vehicle with which to prevent accurate information from reaching the public, but the kinds of inaccuracies he seeks to promulgate as a replacement. It is not so much that he denies the validity of the way in which we used our documentation in agents, for example, as that he denies such documentation exists. The upshot here is that he deliberately portrays the FBI, which in actuality went to extraordinary lengths to block disclosure of its AIM files in the 1970s, and which has clamped the tightest mantle of secrecy around them ever since, as a model of propriety, thoroughly forthcoming and above board in the handling of these records, with nothing hidden about its anti-AIM campaign. The image projected by Theo Harris's reference to a fictional release of AIM files is that the Bureau, which in reality has once again taken to treating the Freedom of Information and Privacy Acts as so much toilet paper, generally refusing to release any new document unless expressly required to do so by court order, is that of an open agency, which typically makes its records available to researchers and the public at large. The resultant misimpression is a building block in the reviewer's reasonably subtle construction of the real contrast he wishes to impart concerning what was done to the Black Panther Party and what was done to AIM. The locus of the false distinction Theo Harris is after lies not so much within the experiences of the two groups as within the FBI itself. In the quote-unquote bad old days of COINTELPRO, the story goes, the Bureau was proven to have committed criminal acts and used official secrecy to conceal them. But those days ended forever in the wake of the Church Committee investigations, when an FBI agent like Richard W. Held orchestrated a program in 1971 to disrupt and destroy the Los Angeles Black Panther Party. Theoharis agrees that this was a political counterintelligence program because FBI documents released to the Church Committee concerning these activities bore the caption COINTELPRO. However, when the same agent was involved in the same type of program using exactly the same techniques against AIM on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1975, or the Puerto Rican independence movement in San Juan in 1985, Theoharis would have us believe this could not have been a COINTELPRO because the FBI has not released related documents bearing said caption. And according to him, for us to assert otherwise is by definition simply guilt by association. The pacifying effect upon readers intended by the spooning up of this stale pabulum is unmistakable. And for the relative few who might remain skeptical in the face of this sort of reassurance, the reviewer offers a slightly different tranquilizer. They are calmly handed the option of sharing, quote, the author's outrage over some of the Bureau's post-COINTELPRO investigative methods and the fairness of the American legal system. As if in the end we had somehow all agreed that it is only investigative rather than counterintelligence techniques which are at issue, and that the actions of the FBI in this quarter conform to some recognizable system of legality. The invitation extended to skeptics is thus no more than a final touch to the review's main purpose, a ruse designed not only to divert the last measure of attention away from what is contained in Agents, but to posit in its stead an impression of the reviewer's preferred version of reality. We have arrived at the core of the myth, perpetuation of which constitutes the real purpose of reviews such as Theoharis's. This is and has always been the central myth of the FBI, regardless of the variations and complexities of the lesser mythologies required to support it at a given moment or a given context. It has remained remarkably consistent and ultimately reducible to its simplest terms. Don't worry, everything is okay now. No matter when or in what circumstances the Bureau has been called to account, its official spokespeople and unofficial apologists can be counted upon to queue up and say whatever is necessary to pass along the idea that while there may have been quote-unquote problems or errors, these have all been corrected. There has never been in such recountings any current reasons for worry or concern. All has already been set right. This theme prevailed in the 1920s in the wake of the Palmer raids. It was maintained in the 1930s after the worst of the Bureau's union busting had been completed. It continued in the 1940s when the true extent of the FBI's surveillance of the citizenry began to be apparent. During the 50s, it held up even as the Bureau's linkages to McCarthyism were exposed. In the 60s, those who would pose uncomfortable questions concerning FBI activities were, like Martin Luther King, dismissed as liars and paranoids. Even during the 1970s, as the COINTELPRO revelations were ushered forth, the myth was used as the Bureau's major defense, and in the end, as always, it held sway. Meanwhile, through it all, the apparatus of political repression, which the myth was created to shield, continued, essentially unhindered by real public scrutiny of any sort, to be evolved, perfected, and applied. As we enter the 90s, the FBI's slaughter of AIM militants has long since been completed and hidden from view. CISPES, Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, and some 200 other domestic dissident groups have more recently found themselves monitored, disrupted, and occasionally destabilized by Bureau operatives using many of the same COINTELPRO tactics employed against quote-unquote New Left organizations 2 decades ago. And still, Professor Theo Harris would have us believe the FBI no longer engages in political counterintelligence programs, and when evidence emerges to the contrary, the Bureau, not the victims, should be given every benefit of the doubt. We readily concur with his assessment that these are, quote, important questions of decided contemporary relevance. Unlike him, however, we will continue to conclude that their importance lies in the fact that concerning the form and function of the FBI, things have never been okay. Further, we will continue to assert that things will never be okay in this regard until the realities both he and the Bureau seek so desperately to hide are brought fully into the open, until the whole pattern of FBI performance has at last been pieced completely together, called by its right name, and placed before the public. Then, perhaps real corrective action can occur. Unquestionably, the start of any such positive process must rest in destroying the myth Theo Harris so clearly presents. The COINTELPRO Papers. Citation of materials not readily accessible to the general public is not in itself sufficient to decide such issues, and this takes us right back to the proposition that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Therefore, in this follow-up volume to Agents, we will photographically reproduce a substantial selection of the FBI documents which led us to the conclusions expressed in Agents. Hence, when we say, for example, that the Bureau was engaged from its earliest moments in precisely the same tactics of political repression which later marked the COINTELPRO era per se, we do not intend to leave the matter open to debate or charges of conjecture. Instead, we will provide the exact facsimile of a document, such as the accompanying 1919 letter written by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover proposing a strategy which was ultimately used to neutralize black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey, allowing the Bureau itself to create a word picture concretizing our case for us. As concerns the Garvey letter, readers should take careful note of the fact, clearly drawn by Hoover, that it is not written about an individual who is believed to have violated or is planning to violate any particular law. To the contrary, the FBI director is recommending to the very sort of Justice Department officials whose quote-unquote review Theo Harris would have us believe now safeguards us against such FBI activities, that the federal government devote its vast legal resources to contriving a case, any case, against Garvey to make him appear guilty of a crime. In this way, the black dissident's eventual imprisonment could be made to seem a simple criminal matter, rather than the act of political repression it actually was. The key to understanding what really happened in the Garvey case lies squarely in appreciation of the fact that the decision to bring about his elimination had been made at the highest level of the Bureau long before any hint of criminal conduct could be attached to him. In the same vein, when we contend that upon approval of Hoover's plan, the FBI used infiltrators against Garvey's non-criminal United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, in order to cast about the some kind of evidence through which a plausible cause against its leader could be developed, we are prepared to back it up. For instance, we can reproduce the 1921 report to the Bureau from James Wormley, codenamed Confidential Agent 800, a black man paid by the Bureau to work his way into a position of trust within the UNIA. It should be noted that even with this highly placed source of inside information, the FBI was unable to assemble any sort of case against Garvey in its first 2 attempts, both of which had to be abandoned for lack of even the appearance of substance. In the end, Having charged him with everything from income tax evasion to conspiracy, the Bureau managed to obtain a conviction on only a single, relatively minor count of mail fraud. This was enough, however, to take the black leader out of the political arena and into Atlanta federal prison, from whence he could be deported as an undesirable alien in 1927. Or, if we wish to leap 3 decades ahead and assert that comparable methods were utilized by the Bureau vis-a-vis liberal government officials such as Alger Hiss, an expedient in promoting McCarthyism and the Red Scare of the late 1940s and early 50s, we can produce documents to this effect. For example, consider the accompanying letter from Horace Schmall to FBI agent Thomas Spencer. Schmall, it should be noted, was an ostensible private investigator retained by his defense attorneys to ferret out evidence which would exonerate their client from charges he used a position in the State Department to spy for the Soviet Union. In actuality, Schmall was reporting directly to the Bureau on every nuance of the defense strategy, a matter which undoubtedly proved a great boon in the government's securing of a conviction. The particular missive from Schmall we reproduce is especially interesting because it shows him alerting the FBI to Hiss's attorney's plan to argue on an appeal that the key piece of evidence introduced by the government at the trial, a Woodstock typewriter once owned by Hiss, the type irregularities of which supposedly matched those appearing in alleged espionage correspondence, could have been altered to produce the desired result. Schmall's warning allowed the Bureau sufficient time to assemble a countering argument that no such modifications to a typewriter were possible. When we say the FBI was aware that its counter-argument, which served to keep the government's quote-unquote proof of espionage propaganda campaign alive and Hiss in prison, was categorically untrue, we can make our case by reproducing the accompanying January 1951 memo from A.H. Belmont to D.M. Ladd, in which the author admits the, quote, FBI laboratory advised that it would be possible for a person who was well versed in typewriter defects and similarities in type design to construct a typewriter so that it would make these defective characteristics appear on paper when the machine was used. Instructively, both documents were among the many thousands of pages in its Hiss files that the Bureau kept secretly for nearly 3 decades after the case was closed. Both of the examples used thus far have seemed to demonstrate that the reality of COINTELPRO greatly predates the formal adoption of the acronym during the 1950s. If, on the other hand, we wish to demonstrate that this reality has continued to exist after the FBI so pointedly abandoned the term in 1971, we can readily illustrate our point. We can, for example, simply reproduce the accompanying September 1983 teletype concerning the infiltration of an agent with quote-unquote extensive undercover experience into the Dallas chapter of CISPES. And lest the reader be persuaded the Bureau was doing this because it genuinely believed the organization was engaged or planning to engage in bona fide criminal activities, terrorism, according to current FBI Director William Sessions, attention should be paid to the next reproduction, a November 1983 teletype originally classified as secret. It explains rather clearly that the FBI found it, quote, imperative to formulate some plan of attack against CISPES, not because of its suspected involvement in terrorism or any other criminal activity, but because of its association with individuals who defiantly display their contempt for the U.S. government by making speeches and propagandizing their cause. In plain English, CISPES was politically objectionable to the Bureau, no more or less, and was therefore deliberately targeted for repression. COINTELPRO, by any other name, is still COINTELPRO. The collection of FBI self-portraits contained herein is far from exhaustive. There are several reasons for this, beginning, of course, with the fact that so many of the Bureau's documents remain secret. Conversely, the material which has been released runs into hundreds of thousands of pages, most portions of which are redundant, a seemingly endless repetition of the same theme. Many thousands of the documents released over the years were provided in such poor quality that they are simply impossible to reproduce with enough clarity to render them legible in book format. Still others were released in such deleted form as to be useless in any way at all. A final problem presents itself in that the Bureau has run so many of these sorts of counterintelligence operations and over such an extended period that any attempt to offer a comprehensive start-to-finish exposition would inevitably prove too bulky for a single volume or even a dozen volumes. Some means of not only organizing but limiting the material we wish to present has therefore been necessary. The method we have employed has been to focus our attention on several of the entities the FBI itself has targeted for its fiercest attacks: the Puerto Rico independence movement, the Black Liberation Movement, particularly the Black Panther Party, and the American Indian Movement. Additionally, we will provide sections illustrating the tactics employed against a new left organization, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and two of the old left, the Communist Party, USA, and the Socialist Workers' Party, SWP. In each case, given constraints of available space, we will provide background narrative to ground our study, to provide readers with insights into the specific historical and topical context from which the COINTELPROs emerged and functioned, both socially and politically. In each instance, we also provide an overview of FBI counterintelligence operations vis-a-vis the Bureau's COINTELPRO targets, since such things were supposedly stopped in 1971. Most of the documentary material, with the exception of that concerning AIM, is drawn directly from the period when COINTELPRO reigned in its own name. This is partly because the documents are virtually crystalline in their representation of what the FBI's domestic counterintelligence operations are all about. It is also because, like the official non-bureau sources we utilize in agents, they provide so obvious a basis from which to understand the meaning underlying the FBI's AIM documents. The lines of continuity between the pre-COINTELPRO, COINTELPRO, and post-COINTELPRO eras are thereby dramatically underscored, and perhaps as a result an increasing number of activists can learn to recognize them from their own recent experiences. If so, this volume will have amply served its purpose, for in such recognition may be forged the means by which we may surmount the process of official political repression which has served for so long to abort the potential for positive social change in the United States. In our view, participation in the fostering of such change is the sole defensible motivation for anyone to engage in the acts of writing or publishing at the present time. Clearly, there were many reasons for our doing this book, but it was the outlook expressed immediately above which ultimately proved decisive. In the end, we have assembled the COINTELPRO papers not simply to vindicate agents of repression, or to have another bibliographical entry in the curriculum vitae, but to amplify the conclusions we reached in that volume. Simultaneously, we have sought to create a readily accessible mini-archive which will ultimately say more than we ever could. We have felt a responsibility to do this because the sad fact is that COINTELPRO lives. We must all learn its face. Only in unmasking it can we ever hope to destroy it and move forward to our more constructive goals and objectives. Ward Churchill and Jim Vanderwall, Boulder, Colorado, May 1990. End of introduction. Read by Exam Info. Please click the links below to donate or become a Patreon member. Thank you for listening and thank you for your continued support.